Hello once again, everybody. Don Stacy here. I'm going to read the next story from my collection of science fiction, Late Night Fare. Wilson got out of bed in his usual reluctant fashion just after a hired Enronian opened his bedroom door to announce that the day had begun, sir. The Enronian was a clever young fellow, as Wilson himself had to admit a few days after the youth had begun to work in the house, doing a variety of chores, with both Saturday and Sunday off. Did Wilson ever consider that he might be exploiting this kid with the going minimum wage? During the Enronian's first week, this thought did occur to Wilson twice, perhaps, but he soon forgot about what the boy's life must be like at home. The boy's name was Velocil. He performed his duties with neither verve nor sloth, kept a steady pace throughout the day as though he were digging a hole, something he had done for amusement when he was younger, a child running about the countryside without a care in the world. Now, among all the expensive furniture and ornamental vases and smooth wooden sculptures in this house owned by the man named Wilson, he worked not quite 4 hours each day, a split shift, 2 hours early each morning, then 2 more hours early each evening. He was always supposed to address Mr. Wilson as Sir. This requirement arose when Wilson quickly realized that he'd hear the boy pronounce his name repeatedly during those few moments when they happened to occupy the same room together. Of course, the boy had no idea what Wilson did for a living, but Velocil was smart enough to realize that the man made a lot of money. Not everyone could hire an Enronian to clean and cook and perform any other requested task. They were paid servants, after all, even though they worked for slaves' wages. Huh. Recall, I can't do without him. All right. All right. One evening, after Velocil brought a tray out from the kitchen and served the dinner he'd finished preparing only moments earlier to his employer, Wilson said, "How do you travel back and forth between here and your home, Velocil? Do you walk?" "Oh, no, sir. My home is much too far away for that. I take a public hover shuttle each morning." "I've never ridden one of those," Wilson said, growing more interested. "What are they like?" "Oh, they always cluster in front of the main entrance to our resident buildings, and you just get in and tell it where you want to go, and they whisk you away. My younger sister wants me to take her along sometime, so she can see how it's done," I told her. "It's very simple, Cassandra. Like sitting down on a park bench, you stand there, wait a few seconds, and the next hover shuttle in line will issue up beside you. The door slides open, you get in, the door slides shut, then all you do is tell the voice where you want to go and it takes you there. But it's free public transportation, so you can't abuse it. You can't ride it just for fun. In fact, you're underage, Cassandra, and if they catch you screwing around with the hover shuttle, they will hold you in a detention cell until our mother and our unreliable father pays to have you released and sent home under escort." "Of course, I've owned my own hover shuttle for years," Wilson said with a nervous, though somehow satisfied shrug. "So I was a bit curious as to what they're like." Well, they can hold up to 4 people, and there's always music being played. What sort of music? Oh, they never play songs, just orchestral music. Anything else, sir? No, that will be all, Bill also. Wilson was a young entrepreneur who had made a small fortune from an invention he toiled on in his spare time for over 3 years. Now all his labors had begun to pay off. His patent enabled him to live quite comfortably on the royalty payments alone. Anytime someone wanted to utilize Wilson's remarkably innovative design for a holographic projector, their attorney would have to contact Wilson's attorney, and then over a period of a few weeks, a percentage of future profits agreed to, a contract would be drawn up and the document signed. Yes, Wilson was on Easy Street now. He usually went to his recently acquired private office after parking his hover shuttle in the basement facility. Although, sometimes he chose to first stop at a coffee shop before beginning his workday. That morning, he lingered over a cup of coffee and read a holographic newspaper, using one of the many little gadgets which, in recent times, had employed Wilson's own patented design. The news was invariably dreary. Another electrolysis plant had been bombed by either the anarchists or the terrorists. Neither group had claimed responsibility for the attack. The hydrogen fuel for the hover shuttle of whatever capacity came directly from the electrolysis plants, piped under high pressure for a maximum rate of delivery in order to meet current demands. The hydrogen fuel was not only vital, it was crucial to the continued welfare of citizens everywhere. The anarchists and the terrorists despised each other. The anarchists had nothing to do with religion whatsoever. To them, religion posed an insurmountable barrier to the continued improvement of human life. The terrorists held the anarchists in contempt as nothing but godless radicals who were without purpose other than to destroy the social order, first cripple a country economically, then destroy all places of religion from border to border. Wilson paid for his coffee with his scanned thumbprint and walked along the landscaped sidewalk lined with bushes and flowers and trees. The walk to the coffee shop and then back to the office building invigorated him with the morning's cold, fresh air. For a moment he thought of how it must have been for people back in the 20th and 21st centuries, stewing in their own poisonous air. It must have been dreadful at times, everyone wearing fine woven cloth masks. He rode one of the dozen elevators in which one was always obliged to squeeze into. A small cubicle with 10 or more people, releasing passengers and acquiring a few new ones as it rose toward the roof of the building. Wilson had gone up to the roof initially just out of curiosity. He hadn't had a chance to gaze out over the city in quite some time. So when he first acquired his office, his security card would allow him to take the elevator to the uppermost floor, from which one had to mount a flight of stairs up through a plain concrete stairwell to a door which required the card to open. Someone, or quite likely a crew of laborers, had gone to a great deal of trouble to enshrine a lavish garden on the roof. Wilson had asked several others, tenants in the buildings as well, who might have produced such a place. No one seemed to know. No one ever saw anyone up there except the building's maintenance crew assigned to the place as groundskeeper. After he had stepped through the door and then closed it, Wilson saw a trifurcating path made of a coarse ceramic tile pass into a tame forest of native species. as he later found out, when he had a conversation with Mr. Jiang, the still able-bodied 75-year-old Chinese groundskeeper. Wilson took the left-hand path and entered the roof forest, and immediately spotted an old man squatting along the edge of the path as he coiled up a hose. As Wilson approached, the old man rose and greeted him. "Ah, you've come to visit the forest. I don't see many visitors this time of year. I've just rented a studio office, their smallest offering, and the only thing I could afford." "I'm glad to meet you," the old man said, offered to shake hands. "And this place is unbelievable. I never would have imagined the roof of a building could look so amazing. Transferring the trees with a crane, which we then planted in quasi-random fashion, took a great deal of work," he said. "Yes, I expect it might have," said Wilson, still feeling a little flabbergasted. "I'm rather curious, though. Where does the runoff go? That must be frightfully filthy." "It's piped to an open area beyond the city and then disposed through a series of reducing pipes into the groundwater. It's the least contaminated sewer water you'll find leaving the city." "Well, that's always a plus. Well, I can see that you're busy, so I'll just have a look around." "Enjoy the scenery," the old man said with a slight bow. "That's what it's here for." Wilson walked for a bit, entranced by this tiled path parting its way between the walls of the thin forest. He could hear crickets thriving, frequent bird calls, and beyond, if he chose to listen to it, the thin groaning chant of the city. He was continuously impressed by how much work Jiang and his crew had accomplished. Later that day, after returning to his office from a visit to the roof garden to stretch his legs and get some fresh air, Wilson stood in front of a large window and gazed down to the street 43 floors below. Miniature hover shuttles flowed back and forth in a pair of continuous streams moving in opposite directions. The pursuit of the dollar, Wilson thought. All that traffic down there is propelled by the pursuit of the dollar. I'll be right back. Oh, he had visited an electrolysis plant once, located near an otherwise barren stretch of the Oregon coast. The towering steel frames which supported the high voltage cables marched off toward a region of California and Nevada which had long since been covered with thousands of acres of solar collectors. As he had approached the outskirts of the plant itself, he could smell the distinct scent of ozone emitted from minor instances of escaping electrical current. Enormous ceramic-coated steel tanks, each as tall as a 10-floor building, were used as temporary storage vessels for the separated hydrogen and oxygen. He had only been permitted to drive through the sprawling operation, a complex arrangement of pipes and tanks and the electrolysis pools and the ozone-scented air. Wilson had become restless once again. He hadn't come up with a new invention since his breakthrough design for the holographic projector. He began to worry that he might have gone stale somehow, simply having lost the gift to come up with a new idea. He went back to his workstation, which was a cramped affair, a pair of non-intersecting walls, each 10 feet long, built at an angle of precisely 120 degrees. These walls descended from and withdrew back into the ceiling at preset times, or by voice command. The computer, our invisible servant, would take care of all the rest. Each of these walls served as a high-definition computer screen, which could be operated by either touch or voice. There was an art movement back in the 20s and 30s of the 20th century which arose in Italy. Followers of this school called themselves futurists and developed an aesthetic based on the glorification of machinery. They were thought quite avant-garde for a time, then fell out of favor after Cubism took hold in the form of the works of the ever-crafty Picasso. There would never be another Picasso, thought Wilson. 2 centuries later, no one had come close to that primitivist and modernist master. With these thoughts about painting, he happened to recall the lawsuit he was forced to engage in after a company who intended to corner the holographic art market infringed on his patent rights, a rather controversial high-profile case as it turned out. He had been compelled to spend a fortune on his attorney to make sure that he got what was rightfully his, another royalty payment. Wilson left his office shortly after 5 o'clock as the elevator door opened. A middle-aged Enronian met his gaze for a moment. Then he glanced down and shoved out the custodian's cart behind which he stood. As Wilson rode the elevator to the basement parking facility, he thought of the man he had just seen, hunched over his cart. Maybe the janitors in this building belonged to a union, he mused. When he got into his hover shuttle, a female voice said, "What would you like to drink this evening? The usual?" "That's right, Lydia, and don't be sparing like you were the last time." "I should have warned you sooner that we were down to the last bottle, Mr. Wilson. You could allow me to perform errands on my own. Now you'll have to go to the supermarket yourself." "Don't get fresh, Lydia." "All right, head to the supermarket. Besides, Velasco told me this morning that we were nearly out of meat in the freezer. I was also instructed to buy some onions and broccoli." "Got it, boss." The supermarket was a purely automated affair. Each customer stood before a computer screen and placed their order for meat, produce, frozen meals of any sort, from dietary to gourmet, household products, kitchen implements, a variety of electronic devices, and other garden variety tools. Also available were cigarettes, pipe tobacco, and cigars, innumerable brews of beer, vintages of wine, and varieties of liquor, marijuana, and hashish. People who wanted more potent medicine had to go to a pharmacy. Late in the 21st century, the government passed a law by voice acclamation. Its popularity was so great to place pharmacies outside of supermarkets in separate buildings. After the worldwide legalization of all substances used for personal consumption, the rates of addiction throughout the world would finally become quantified with great precision. But one unforeseen problem had arisen. Cocaine, pain pill and heroin addicts would sometimes shamble into a supermarket, and the other customers would see these people in frightful physical condition, people who were clearly suffering from an illness of the sort which happened to be self-inflicted. Many of them had open, festering sores on their necks and faces. Some were slack-jawed and dim-eyed, and most of them left a trail of a reeking stench behind them. Women were the first to complain about the insurgence of addicts into the supermarkets, their ghastly demeanor frightening the children. They found the presence of these people highly disturbing. In one of those rare instances, the union of the world's legislative bodies voted by voice acclamation. The pharmacies would now be completely disengaged from the supermarkets, plucked out by voice decree of the World Union, and women and children would no longer be exposed to the unnerving spectacle of self-destructive people. At home once again, Wilson parked his hover shuttle inside a commodious garage, the walls of which were lined with hand tools for both machinery and electronics. He had more and larger equipment in the basement, a metal lathe, a drill press, and various grinders, tap and die equipment, and so on. A small machine shop, essentially. Veloso stepped into the garage through the kitchen door and greeted his employer. "It was getting rather late, sir. I wasn't sure if you'd get back in time for me to carry the groceries into the house." Traffic seemed unusually slow for some reason, Wilson said, thinking with an air of grievance. A glitch in the transportation system the software engineers would have to iron out. "I'll have your dinner ready in 15 minutes, sir. It's almost 7 o'clock, Veloso, so you needn't bother. Why don't you knock off and head on home? Oh, and by the way, I've decided to give you a raise. Personally, I think the minimum wage of 11 AUs an hour is a scandal. From now on, you'll be getting 17 AUs an hour, so go home and tell your parents and have a little celebration." Veloso produced a beaming smile and said, "Thank you very much, sir. My mother will be greatly pleased." After the boy left, Wilson went into the kitchen and heated one of the frozen meals he had once consumed each night after he got home from work and before he stepped into his garage, the hover shuttle parked right outside in the driveway. There in the garage, Wilson strove to not only improve devices already in vogue, but to come up with something entirely new. Wilson had developed a unique high-level machine language to program the device he invented, which reduced processor usage to such an extent that the devices worked flawlessly. Prior to his invention of an altogether new design for a holograph projector which could create opaque visual forms, the gadgets he'd come up with were hardly more than novelties. But after obtaining his patent, Wilson made enough money from design contracts and licensing fees that he quit his day job as a commodities broker. About 6 months later, a clever electrical engineer who had once posed for a fashion magazine in her younger college days developed the new property of interactivity among various holographic images which were or were not bound by the strictures of the physical laws of nature and common sense. The next step would be interactivity between the holographic image and a human being. Wilson himself suggested they first tried to develop a holographic baseball. There was some discussion on the internet blog sites and in a few select cafes and bars where people met to press their way along in the world with greater or lesser success, where the innovators and developers would mingle with their own kind. Essentially, these holographic forms were nothing more than waves of photons corralled and reflected to behave in the desired manner. Oh, what a mime once did with an imaginary object, anyone could do now with many different objects, the newspaper having so far proved to be the most challenging, but further advances were expected in the near future. In the field of technological innovation, Wilson enjoyed a modest success. Along with the substantial uptick of income, talk show hosts had begun to invite him onto their programs. With the new holographic technology, interactive talk shows had become standard fare. As long as people had holographic cameras in their living rooms, they could be seen on a national talk show in a brief dialogue with the celebrity host or one of the evening's guests. This illusion of being able to hobnob with actors and politicians and writers and scientists and corporate CEOs, of course, soon became all the rage. As long as they chose you from the tens of thousands of phone-in calls, you would gain national exposure, however brief. As a matter of fact, Wilson was recently invited to appear on Tommy Sand's late-night show. This would be Wilson's first strictly non-technical forum, and he was a bit nervous. In only 4 more days, he would have to appear in front of a live audience. Of course, there would be a script. Those people leave nothing to chance. Wilson himself watched very little television and at first had no idea who this Sands fellow even was. After watching the late-night show with Tommy Sands, Wilson got a sense of the man, a satiric-minded comedian who wanted to leave you with the impression that he was better informed than most when it came to cutting-edge technology. Those few hour days drove Wilson into a fit of continual nervous tension. Even in his own home, sometimes his eyes would dart about at the slightest noise from outdoors. He grew more apprehensive each day as this special night approached. The evening arrived, and he felt very much himself as he put on a fresh shirt and knotted his necktie. He felt up to par, as his father might have said, a man who played golf to be sociable. The television studio would send a special hover shuttle to pick him up. Wilson left his large landscaped home and walked to the street and up to the limousine. A door slid open, and as he moved to get inside this posh conveyance, he saw that he was not to be the only passenger. Already seated on a firm leather-covered cushion was a blonde woman in a black evening dress. Thank God he was wearing a suit, otherwise he would have looked like a bumpkin in boots and sneakers. Or sneakers. Oh, Wilson greeted her while getting seated, never once taking his eyes from her startling, beautiful face. A breathtaking beauty, Wilson was thinking, and said, "I'm delighted to meet you, whoever you are. My name's Willow McSimmons, Mr. Wilson. I'm your guide for the evening. You can think of me that way if you like. We know this is all entirely new for you in the sense of social experience, if I may be so bold. First of all, we're not very formal, although sometimes we use the word doctor, but only for MDs. You only have to look at this whole business from Tommy's perspective, which is the showbiz angle. Out in front of the audience, everyone's on equal footing, as though everyone sees each other all the time, which is obviously impossible. No one ever says a bad word about anyone, but we do laugh at people now. You've gone through the script, you've seen it, right? So you know that Tommy is going to crack a few jokes at your expense. But as you see, our writers won't let Tommy get away with it completely because they've given you some good comebacks. So, David, do you think you're ready? Barring a collision prior to reaching the studio, I expect I'll do well enough, Wilson replied. Almost 3 hours later, Wilson sat alone in the studio's green room and watched a large wall-mounted monitoring screen as Tommy's nightly show proceeded to its conclusion. The 3 other guests were already out on the stage with Tommy. That's odd. Who seemed to be winding up his interview with the 3rd guest. Wilson had seen Willow drop in just for a moment before she had led each of the other guests to the stage. At any moment she'd be back for him. Almost as he thought of this, Willow came into the green room. You'll be up in a moment, David. We don't want to keep the audience waiting. He followed her down a hallway and through one of the backstage doors. As soon as they were inside, he could hear Tommy telling his audience about his next guest. Wilson felt a swooping sense of vertigo as he heard Willow whisper into his ear, "When Tommy asks the audience to welcome you with their applause, that's your cue, my friend. Just walk on out there and greet Tommy. We'll talk later." With that, she disappeared. A moment later, Wilson heard his cue and he stepped beyond the curtain into the glittering lights of the television stage set where Tommy performed his nightly sessions of wit and satire. He stepped up to the wide curving desk behind which Tommy was now standing, crossed in front of it and up toward the vacant seat next to the desk. The three other guests, two men and a woman, two actors and a singer,